So today we're going to look at the inverse function. Now, maybe you have been exposed to this, but what the inverse function is, so what the inverse function is basically a function where the x and y values are swapped. So putting this in perspective, guys, let's take a look at the equation or the function y is equal to x squared, okay? Or we can think about it as f of x is equal to x squared, right? So if this is x and this is f of x, also known as y, then these are some of the points that we can kind of plug into the equation. This would be 4, 1, 0, 1, and 4. And the way I would have solved for these values, I would have plugged in these values into the equation, and I would have got the value outputted. Okay. Now these are some of the points that exist on your function, and you can plot these points on a graph, and that would basically, you can plot these points on a grid, and that would basically generate the graph. Now what the inverse function is, it's a function where the x and y values are swapped, right? So the inverse function is a function where the x and y values are swapped. So an inverse function is the inverse of a particular function, right? So if this is a particular function, f of x, the inverse function we usually denote as f inverse of x. Basically, those equivalent points will look like this instead. Now x becomes y, so you have 4, and y becomes x, so you have 2. So it's almost the opposite, right? In this case, the point here would be -1 and 1. This point here would be -2 and 4. This point here would be 0 and 0. This point here would be 1 and 1, and this point here would be 2 and 4. In the inverse function, those points would just be swapped. So now you're going to have 4 and 2 instead, right? You're going to have 1 and -1. You're still going to have 0 and 0, 1 and 1, and 4 and 2. Okay, so you can notice how this kind of works out. And this basically will change the shape of the graph. Okay, and if you compare the two, this equation here, or this graph here, well, if we already know what the shape of this graph looks like, it's basically a parabola, right? So you're gonna have a curve. Sorry about that. Let me just clean that up a little bit. So normally y is equal to x squared is a parabola. The curve is gonna look like this, right? It's gonna be concave up. But the inverse function actually, if you graph this out, it looks a little bit different, right? So this would be like 4 and 2. And I would honestly, guys, ask you to graph this on grid paper and see what it looks like, right? And you can notice that the values will look a little different, right? So you have 1 and -1. So that could be like, let's say this is 1 and -1, right? So the points are going to look a little different. Okay, so you might also have like 1 and 1. Whoops. Oh, this actually isn't even a function. This actually looks like a relation. So sometimes the inverse function is a relation. So what you can do here is you could just plot some of these points, take a look at the shape,